When we think of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that one iconic speech, I Have a Dream, usually comes to mind. But the last decade of his life shows this incredible, radical evolution in his thinking. So we're going to trace that transformation by looking at three key speeches. You'll see how his lens on America just widened so dramatically between 1957 and 1968. So our journey covers 11 really critical years. We're going to start in 1957, where the focus was all about inner psychological freedom. Then we jump forward a decade, and his lens has widened to a full-on critique of the entire nation. We'll end in 1968, just weeks before his death, with what was his most urgent and far-reaching call to action. It's amazing to see how each stage just powerfully builds on the last. All right, let's go back to 1957. This is long before the March on Washington. At this point, Dr. King was really focused on the internal damage that centuries of oppression had caused. He knew that this fight wasn't just about changing laws on paper. It was about healing the mind. To get his point across, Dr. King would use this twisted piece of logic. It's just chilling, right? He was exposing how religion and even philosophy had been warped to justify slavery. It created this rationale where if you could just prove someone wasn't fully human, well then any cruelty becomes justifiable. For Dr. King, the absolute greatest tragedy of physical slavery was that it led to what he called mental slavery. Think about that. It's this deep internal paralysis where people start to believe the lies that are told about them, the lie that they are in fact inferior. But then Dr. King saw a change starting to happen. He argued that as the world around people changed, as they moved from rural farms to big industrial cities, as literacy went up, a massive shift in self-perception began. People started to see themselves in a new light, to believe that they were, in his words, somebody. And this idea is absolutely crucial to his philosophy at the time. He totally rejected what he called negative peace. That's just the absence of tension, right? Which usually just means one group is quietly putting up with injustice. He instead championed positive peace, which he defined as the active, tangible presence of real justice. Okay, now let's jump forward a whole decade to 1967. The world had changed. Big civil rights laws had been passed, but frustration was just boiling over in cities all across the country. And in response, Dr. King's focus expanded dramatically. He's moved way beyond just the idea of self-respect to delivering this searing critique of America's priorities and its deep moral failures. He said America had a poverty of the spirit, that we had guided missiles but misguided men. This quote just nails it. It perfectly captures his fear that our incredible scientific and technological progress had completely left our moral and ethical progress in the dust. So he pinpointed the nation's core moral problems down to these triple evils: racism, poverty, and war. And this is the key part. He saw them not as separate issues, but as these deeply interconnected forces where each one just feeds and reinforces the others. And to show just how massive the problem of poverty was, he described it as a monstrous octopus. And he was so clear that this was not just a black issue. He pointed to 40 million Americans of all races, Indians, Mexican Americans, poor whites in Appalachia, all caught in its grip. And here, this is where Dr. King laid out the nation's priorities in the most shocking terms you can imagine. Get this. He cited figures showing it cost the government $500,000 to kill one enemy soldier in Vietnam, but it was spending only $53 a year on each of its own citizens living in poverty. Just wow. And that was his core point. The problem wasn't a lack of money. It wasn't a lack of ability. America was the richest nation in the history of the world. The problem, he said, was a lack of will. It was a complete and total misordering of our priorities as a nation. So now we landed his final major speech in Los Angeles. This is just 3 weeks before he was assassinated. And the tone here is just raw, it's urgent, it's more radical than anything before it. You can really feel the weight of all the years and all the battles he's fought. Right before this speech, a major presidential commission, the Kerner Commission, released a report on all the civil unrest. And its findings were this stunning validation of everything Dr. King had been saying for years. America was literally splitting apart, creating two separate and unequal societies. In this speech, he just masterfully tears down the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps argument.
He said it was absurd to tell a man to pull himself up by his bootstraps when he doesn't even have boots. He pointed out that while the government was giving away millions of acres of land to white settlers from Europe, it offered absolutely nothing to the formerly enslaved people who had worked that same land for centuries for free.
And then he shared this deeply personal and just painful story. His own kids, who were in a newly integrated school, were in a concert called Music That Made America Great. And the concert, it featured no Black spirituals, no music from their heritage, but it ended with the entire school singing Dixie. And that heartbreaking moment led him to ask this powerful question. He connected that cultural erasure, the denial of Black history and contribution, directly back to that psychological struggle for self-worth that he was talking about all the way back in 1957. See how it all comes full circle? By 1968, he saw this unbreakable link. In his mind, the huge human and financial cost of the Vietnam War was the single biggest thing stopping America from actually dealing with racism and poverty back home. Now, you can imagine he faced intense criticism for speaking out against the war. So many people told him to just stick to civil rights. But for Dr. King, it had become a moral line he had to cross. To be silent, he said, was to betray his deepest principles and the very people he was fighting for.
And this all led to his final, most ambitious vision, the Poor People's Campaign. The plan was to bring thousands of poor people, of all races, to Washington, D.C. They weren't coming to beg for charity, they were coming to demand economic justice. The goal was simple and radical: a federal guarantee of a job or a livable income for every single American.
So when we step back and look at this whole 11-year journey, what do we really see? Well, we see a leader whose understanding of the problem just got deeper and more systemic as time went on. It's a really clear path, isn't it? He began with the internal fight for dignity and self-respect. But by the very end, he was calling for a fundamental restructuring of the entire American economic and political system, connecting the dots between racism at home, poverty, and militarism abroad. And that leaves us with a really powerful question for today. Dr. King eventually saw these three evils, racism, poverty, and militarism, as tangled up, as inseparable parts of a single crisis. The question his legacy asks us is pretty simple. Do we?